The story of a man building a massive boat to save humanity has fascinated people for centuries. Some see it as a powerful tale of faith and survival, while others question or even mock the idea. No matter where you stand, it's a story that refuses to be forgotten. Noah and his ark have been represented in many different ways over the years. But what did the ark really look like? Does the Bible shed any light on the size or construction of the ark? How would it compare to the ships we have today? How could Noah possibly round up all the animals on the earth? Has Noah's ark been found? Or is there any archaeological proof to this story? Is there any symbolism in the ark? All of these questions and more will be answered as we explore the Genesis account of Noah's ark. The account of Noah and the ark is one of the most widely known events in the history of mankind. Unfortunately, like other Bible accounts, in this day and age, it is often taken as a mere fairy tale. However, truth, as they say, can often be stranger than fiction. For Bible-believing Christians, the Bible is the true history book of the universe, and it's in that light that the most asked questions about the ark and the flood of Noah can and should be answered, with authority and confidence. And if we are to answer the critical questions of the day, let's make sure we're doing it from what the Bible actually says, not versus some straw man argument or popular misconception of the day. For example, most people will often confidently dismiss the account of Noah's ark by simply stating, "There's no way Noah could have fit all the animals on the ark." And yet, when you ask them how many animals were needed to go on board, or if they know how big the ark was, they'll often plead ignorance, but then still reiterate, "But there's still no way he could have done it," which shows that they probably have some misconception about Noah's ark and haven't thought through it deeply at all. Let's dive into this and get more specific, and let's begin with this question. Just how large was Noah's ark? Well, unlike the many more whimsical drawings that often depict the ark as some kind of overgrown houseboat with giraffes sticking out of the top, the ark described in the Bible was a huge vessel. It was so large, in fact, that it wasn't likely until the late 1800s that another ship was built that exceeded the capacity of Noah's ark. The key to understanding just how large it was comes directly from the Bible's account of God's commissioning Noah to create this huge craft. In Genesis 6:15 we read, "The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits." Now, the word cubit, the primary unit of measure in the Old Testament, isn't one commonly used today, so understanding the length of a cubit is the key that gives us a good indication of the size we're talking about. The length of a cubit was based on the distance from the elbow to the fingertips, so it obviously varied between ancient people groups. But when Noah came off the ark, only one cubit measurement existed, the one that he had used to construct the ark. The exact length of this cubit is unknown due to the effects of the Tower of Babel, where people scattered from one another and began using their own cubit. So, it requires some logical guesswork to reconstruct the most likely length of the original cubit. Most ancient cultures ended up with 2 cubits, an older or royal cubit and a common or shorter cubit. Using an older cubit, which is the most likely cubit length in Noah's day, we can get a close estimate. One known and well-attested ancient royal cubit was at least 20.4 inches, so we know that the earth must have been no less than 5-10 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high. Now, in the Western world, wooden sailing ships never got much longer than about 330 feet long. Yet, the ancient Greeks had built vessels at least this size 2,000 years earlier. China built huge wooden ships in the 1400s that may also have been as large as the ark. But the biblical ark was one of the largest wooden ships of all time, even though it would be a mid-sized cargo ship by today's standards. But the common question for many skeptics and Christians alike is obvious. How could Noah have possibly built the ark? To most people, the task of building the ship described in the Bible just seems overwhelmingly impossible. Before brushing off the idea, it's worth taking a closer look at what the Bible actually says. The thing is, the Bible doesn't state, word for word, that Noah built the ark entirely by himself. And honestly, that wouldn't make much sense. Think about it. When we read that Solomon built the temple, we don't picture him personally laying every stone or hammering every beam. Instead, he designed it and had skilled workers carry out the construction. So, it's reasonable to assume that Noah did something similar. While he was certainly involved, He likely had help. His sons assisted him, and he could have even hired skilled laborers or had relatives like Methuselah and Lamech contribute to the massive project. Now, let's talk about the timeline. Based on scripture, Noah had anywhere from 55 to 75 years to complete the ark. That's plenty of time, especially when you consider that he wouldn't have been working alone. And despite what some people assume, there's no reason to think that people in Noah's day were any less capable than we are today. In fact, some scientific research suggests that over time, the human genome has been gradually deteriorating due to accumulating mutations. This means people back then may have had stronger bodies and sharper minds than we do now. As for the construction itself, they would have had efficient ways to cut, transport, and assemble massive wooden beams, just like other ancient civilizations that built incredible structures. So, when you really break it down, there's no reason to think that Noah and his team couldn't have built the ark exactly as the Bible describes. If 1 or 2 men today can erect a large house in just 12 weeks, how much more could 3 or 4 men do in a few years? After all, the Bible reveals Adam's descendants were making complex musical instruments, forging metal, and building cities, so their tools, machines, and techniques were not primitive. And history has shown that technology can be lost. In Egypt, China, and the Americas, it was often the earlier dynasties that built more impressive buildings, or had finer art, or better science, than those who came later. For example, the ancient Maya were the first Mesoamerican civilization that built stone cities and astronomical observatories with a mastery of mathematics than the later groups like the Olmecs and Aztecs who came after them never surpassed. And we must recognize that many so-called modern inventions we have today are actually reinventions, like concrete, which was used masterfully by the Romans over 2,000 years ago. Even accounting for the possible loss of technology due to the flood, early post-flood civilizations would have possessed all of the engineering know-how necessary for a project like Noah's Ark. It's very reasonable to believe people were sawing and drilling wood in Noah's day only a few centuries before the Egyptians were sawing and drilling granite. The idea that more primitive civilizations are further back in time is an evolutionary concept. In reality, Scripture says when God created Adam, he was essentially perfect, the best physically and mentally that mankind has ever been. Today, after 6,000 years of sin and decay, the human mind and body aren't what they once were. It might seem like we're getting smarter because of all the technological advancements over the last few centuries, but that's not really due to an increase in intelligence. Instead, it's the result of sharing ideas, publishing knowledge, and building on past inventions, not an actual jump in human capability. Take computers, for example. They might make us feel more advanced, but in reality, they're more of a compensation for our natural decline in mental performance and discipline. These tools allow us to store, organize, and process information in ways our ancestors didn't need, because their intellect and abilities were likely far stronger than ours. Now, let's address one of the biggest questions that always comes up when discussing this massive floating wooden zoological masterpiece. How did Noah round up all those animals? And of course, right after that, there's usually a follow-up. Wait, are you saying Noah had to travel all the way to Australia to pick up some kangaroos and koalas? Usually followed by a chuckle or two. But before making assumptions, let's check what the Bible actually says. In Genesis 6:20, we read, "Of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive." The key phrase here? Will come to you. That changes everything. Let's dig into what that really means. This verse contains a critical key concept in answering the question, because it tells us that Noah didn't have to set out and search or travel to faraway places to bring the animals on board. Thinking it through, with the devastation a global flood would have wrought, the world map would have been completely different before the flood. There would have been no Australia, Iceland, or Africa, for example, none of the continents we have today. And on the basis of Genesis 1:9 and Psalm 104:8-9, there actually may have been only one continent in the beginning. According to the scriptures, there was a call by the Creator. The animals were sent to Noah and simply arrived at the ark, as if called by a homing instinct, some kind of behavior implanted in the animals by God. And, presumably, they would have marched up the ramp all by themselves. Though this was probably a supernatural event when we compare it to the impressive migratory behavior we see in some animals today, it's easily understandable. We are still far from comprehending all the marvelous animal behaviors exhibited in God's creation. The migration of Canada geese and other birds, the amazing flight of monarch butterflies, the annual travels of whales and fish like salmon, hibernation instincts, earthquake sensitivity, and countless other fascinating capabilities of God's animal kingdom. But remember, answering the objection people pose against the account of the ark should be dealt with according to what the scripture plainly says. But what about dinosaurs? Were dinosaurs on the ark? You see, when people begin to realize that the Bible's account of the ark isn't as full of holes as they originally thought, they often begin to bring out their big guns of doubt, asking what they consider to be the toughest questions of all. And the topic of dinosaurs certainly looms large among them. Now, dinosaurs are a subject that bring up all sorts of questions that we simply don't have time to get into here today. But what we'll do is deal with as much of them as we need in order to discuss them in context of Noah's Ark. So, we'll begin by going back to the biblical text. Now, the history of God's creation told in Genesis 1 and 2 tells us that all land-dwelling creatures were made on day 6 of creation week, the same day God made Adam and Eve. Therefore, it's clear without influence from sources outside of Scripture that dinosaurs, being land animals, were made along with man. Also, 2 of every kind, 7 of some, of land animals boarded the ark, and nothing indicates that any of the land animals were already extinct before the flood. Besides, the description of the behemoth in chapter 40 of the book of Job, and of course Job lived after the flood and the dispersal of the animals from the ark after it landed, only fits with something like a sauropod dinosaur. So, the close ancestors of behemoth must have been on board the ark. We also find many dinosaurs that were trapped and fossilized in sedimentary rocks laid down by the Great Flood, that is in flood sediment. And from people groups around the world, widespread legends of encounters with what people refer to generically as dragons give another strong indication that representative dinosaur kinds survived the flood. And obviously, the only way this could have happened is that they were on the ark. Of course, when speaking about dinosaurs and the ark with people, you can almost see the questions tumbling around in their head, and that inevitably come out. But what about how big they were? Even though the ark was huge, could it really have housed giant dinosaurs? Well, juveniles of even the largest land animals wouldn't present a size problem. And being young, they'd have their full breeding life ahead of them. And despite our fascination with the more giant types depicted in museums, popular movies, and books, most dinosaurs weren't very large at all. Most scientists agree that the average dinosaur was actually about the size of a bison. So while some were massive, many were much smaller. That means Noah didn't need to take full-grown versions of every giant creature. For example, it makes sense that God would have brought him 2 young sauropods instead of fully grown ones. The same logic applies to elephants, giraffes, and other large animals. But even if we consider fully grown adults, the ark still had plenty of space to accommodate them. Now, when it comes to the number of dinosaur types, people often assume Noah needed hundreds of different species. But in reality, there were probably only about 60 to 80 actual kinds. Think about how kids' shows group dinosaurs. There are the long-necked ones, the spiky ones, the sharp-toothed ones, and those with beaks or horns. Just like modern dogs vary widely in shape and size, Chihuahuas, Great Danes, Poodles, Huskies, they're all still part of the dog kind. Similarly, dinosaurs likely had much more variation within their kinds than the long lists of species we see today. So, when you really look at it, fitting the animals onto the ark wasn't the impossible task people often assume, and we'll get into even more specifics later on. But for now, let's zoom out and look at the full scale of the flood's impact. Genesis 7:21-22 tells us, "And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died." A common question that follows is, how could a flood possibly destroy every living thing? Well, the Bible makes it clear. This wasn't just a 40-day rainstorm. Even today, just 3 days of extreme rainfall can lead to catastrophic flooding that reshapes landscapes and wipes out wildlife. Imagine an event on a global scale, with the foundations of the deep breaking open, violent oceanic upheavals, and the entire world covered in water. This wasn't just bad weather. This was a divine judgment that reshaped the planet. But the flood event went well beyond torrential rainfall. When the scripture says that the fountains of the great deep broke open, in other words, it's easy to understand earthquakes, volcanoes, and geysers of molten lava and scalding water were squeezed out of the Earth's crust in a violent, explosive upheaval. These fountains were not stopped until 150 days into the flood, so the Earth was literally churning underneath the waters for about 5 months. Continental shifting was occurring until the mountains were lifted up into their approximate current places. There is still some residual mountain building and continental shifting occurring today as a result. The duration of the flood was extensive, and an analysis of the text shows Noah and his family were aboard the ark for around a year. For those that struggle to understand how the flood could be so destructive, a quick internet search with keywords like flash flood reveals hours of footage of how utterly devastating moving water can be. Relatively recent local floods, volcanoes, and earthquakes, though clearly devastating to life and land, are tiny in comparison to the worldwide catastrophe that destroyed and reshaped the world that then existed. As 2 Peter 3:6 describes, Noah's flood accomplished what it had been sent to do. All land, animals, and people not on board the ark were destroyed in the floodwaters, per Genesis 7:21-23. And the result was the billions of animals preserved in the great fossil record we see today. Join us in Chapter 2, next time, as we explore the possible construction of Noah's Ark, its ability to survive such a catastrophic experience, and answer questions as to whether Noah's flood might have possibly been local rather than a worldwide event, as some have proposed, in Part 2 of the Genesis account of Noah's Ark. You can do now one thing: subscribe to be notified when the video drops. Thanks for watching.